Hello, this is the man behind the curtain saying that there really is no man behind the curtain. Don't look at that man behind the curtain. There really is a Wizard of Oz. Moving right along. This is slide 11 of week 2. So let us talk now about Thailand. This is something really sort of irks me in courses about East Asia. They don't even get into this, and it's really very important. The Chakri dynasty began during the early part of this period, as you can see in the readings. Rama I, not pictured here, was an able warrior, but not an able administrator. In contrast, the later leaders, who are pictured here, were outstanding, not only in the context of Thailand and Siam. Again, it used to be Siam in 1937. It became Thailand. But they were also outstanding in world history. And they don't get enough credit, actually, outside of Thailand. Why is that? I'm only going to guess. I think the reason is that they didn't win big wars and conquer lots of territory. But they are revered, especially Rama V in Thailand, as nearly holy figures, not so much in a religious sense anymore by most people, although there is that idea that they are related to the supernatural. Their contemporaries in other countries did not understand Western power and their own position in relation to Western power like these men did. They effectively used their own power to defend territory. It wasn't easy. It was not always a cakewalk. They didn't always win. They lost against the French, for example, in 1873, when the French wanted to take back some of old Cambodian territory so they could have it in their own colony of Indochina. But they could see, I suppose it boils down to 4 things. 1, they understood their own power. 2, they understood how to negotiate with the West. 3, they understood the power of the West. And 4, they used trade to acquire Western armaments, that is, specifically from the United States. They could see, going back to that negotiation piece, they could see the British-French rivalry. They knew how to play the British and French off against each other. That gets a little bit complicated, and I'll try to treat that on the next slide, I guess. And in this slide, I guess it'll have to be. But they understood that they knew that there had been the Franco-Prussian War, for example, which was, now I'm going to fall down and forget my European history. Seems like that was the early 1870s, and the thing I'm talking about between the French and Thailand must have been the early 1880s, but no matter. The important part is that they understood the rivalries between the British and the French. They understood the British and French preferred Thailand to be a buffer state, and they were able negotiators, partly because they sent people to the West to be schooled, and they didn't just send anybody. They sent people who were personally accountable to the government or the royal family, who were almost guaranteed to return. And when they returned, they were guaranteed influential positions. So they modernized. And when I say modernized, what the hell does that mean? That means that they adopted modern technology, including Western weaponry, and they adopted modern Western administrative techniques in administering government. This is very important because they were able to offer predictability to these 2 major powers in their region that were foreigners, the British and the French. They offered a similar government structure to what the British and French were accustomed to themselves. Therefore, communication between governments became much easier. They offered the prospect of a solid business environment, a predictable business environment, so that these companies that wanted to do business with the Thais get their natural resources, sell them things, could go there and not have to worry about the foreign representative, chief office representative, having his head cut off for looking the wrong way at somebody's daughter. These are real problems if you're running a business. And it offered stability to the British and French in their colonies that abutted Thailand, that were next door to Thailand. And when I say that, I'm talking about Burma to the west and Indochina to the east. So very prescient individuals. Let's go on to slide 12. Now, Vietnam was a much different case. Vietnam, although Thailand was involved in the classic tributary system with the Chinese, which we'll get into more later when we talk about China, the classic tributary system where surrounding countries, in some ways, not all, subordinated themselves to the Chinese as the most powerful country in the region and made formal gifts to them which were reciprocated, and recognized the Chinese emperor as the highest religious and indeed even secular authority in the region. The Thais did that to an extent. The Chinese, though, were much more influential in Vietnam, just as they were very influential in Korea. There had been this strong Chinese influence, but it was sort of schizophrenic in a way, and that's because of the 1,000-year occupation that is noted on this slide of Vietnam by China, which meant that there were people who were anti-Chinese and there were people who were Sinophiles, that is, they were interested in and fascinated by the Chinese tradition. The Chinese language was used at a similar level to Korea amongst the elite to learn about the basics of administering a Confucian government. And so there was this desire to copy Chinese ways again, but a strong suspicion of Chinese intentions at the same time. This helped to create a cultural divide that became important later in the division of North Vietnam and South Vietnam during the Cold War, and also was important before that to the French when they divided and ruled in Indochina. Going on to slide 13. The Vietnamese made a very good show of centralizing their administration. Again, this is slide 13. It says Vietnam's Nguyen Dynasty on the top. The Vietnamese made a very good show of centralizing their administration after 1820 in response to the advent of British and French power in the region, but they left out some of those things that I just talked about concerning Thailand. The Thais and the Siamese had absorbed these lessons that I just went over. They sent people to the West to learn its ways. They tried to import arms, and they were successful in creating a modern army and navy. The Vietnamese did not do this. You'll see in the readings that the Thais actually sold commodities from their forests to the U.S. for arms. The Vietnamese never did any such thing. So Vietnam was a ripe plum to be picked, and we'll talk about why that is in just a moment. In the face of the French expansion into their country, they survived, indeed, the Nguyen Dynasty. They survived, however, in name only. The French began this aggressive expansion in the 1880s. The Nguyen Dynasty stayed in place, but gradually declined as the French took over administration first of Vietnam and then present-day Laos and Cambodia. We'll talk about that more as time goes on. Let's go to slide 14. So this is the second half of the talk. It looks like I'll end up having 3 of these uploads. In this part now, we're going to review how the Industrial Revolution in Europe accelerated made more urgent and important the imperial expansion of Europe and American power, European and American power in East Asia. In sum, the Industrial Revolution demanded the capture of resources which existed in large quantity, in rich supply in East Asia. They were essential commodities to industrial development, and they became so important that following the classical trade model that we just discussed, that the Portuguese and the Dutch had used to trade with Asia, was no longer effective or practical if you're sitting in the Admiralty in London. I'll mention them more than once. Now, muscle would be needed, in other words, to secure land and therefore to rule subject peoples. Let's go on to slide 15. It says 1770 to 1819 in perspective. So I'm not going to read through this. Again, I've tried to, some of this is from the reading, some of it is just a general background to give you an idea of the flow of time in these two places, in Europe and America and in Asia, so you can see how they affected each other. In essence, the game was no longer about spices and knickknacks to sell at great profit in the markets of Europe. It was becoming about industrial capability to strengthen armies and navies, and indeed whole economies. In other words, this, for the Europeans, expansion into Asia was all about national survival. I'm not apologizing for colonialism and imperialism when I say this, but it is what it is. It was what it was. So here we can examine this timeline and in later slides, not only British expansion, but that of other nations that followed in their footsteps. And indeed, the British were the trailblazers when it came to imperialism in Asia. Now, the British in the previous period had, 1783, you might recall, had lost America not only as a big colony, but as a big jail. They previously had been sending many of their convicted felons to America. But after America fell, they had to ship them somewhere else, and they had just managed to learn about Australia, which, although some people like to deny it, is in East Asia. Australians like to say, mate, your country, when they're talking to Americans, was founded by pilgrims, and our country was founded by convicts. And there's some truth to that, because in the early days, and it's on this slide, the British First Fleet delivers 1,000 settlers in 1789, etc. In those early days, about half the people that went to Australia were convicts. There was a large percentage as well of soldiers to guard them, and a minority were civilian settlers who had committed no crime. And the idea was that people would be shipped to Australia and would work out their sentence and then be released, basically, into the wilderness, be given land. And we'll get into a little bit more of that in the last slide in this presentation. But suffice it to say that the historical significance of this in East Asia was that the British began establishing colonies on this other continent that was still in Asia, but was far enough away, so immediately it didn't make much difference. Let's go on to slide 16. But the seeds were being planted for great historical change later. So, remember this representation of Australia and New Zealand. You can see from the color-coded stuff here that the British started off in just one area of mainland Australia. They took over Tasmania, and it was only much later they took over New Zealand and the rest of Australia. And you can see how they were expanding through India, and how they eventually got to the border of Burma and met this problem to their east, which they decided to overcome. And you can see how they took over Western Malaysia, present-day Western Malaysia, and the rest of it on the Big Island of Borneo. We'll get into more of that later, but I simply want to note how long it took for these vast territories to be colonized by the British. Going on to slide 17. So one of the major drivers of imperialist expansion during the Industrial Revolution was rubber. This was only one of the commodities that became strategically important. Now, rubber can only be grown in the tropics. At this time, it was only being, that is the 19th century, it was only being grown in Brazil. And while it was only being grown there, the vulcanization process was invented by Charles Goodyear, the same guy whose name is on all the tires here in America and indeed around the world. Nobody else had the seeds for rubber except the Brazilians. And by the way, the Brazilians had declared independence from Portugal in 1822 and they had a brief revolutionary war that killed 5,000 or 6,000 people and lasted for 2 months. Now, if you're in the British Admiralty, and Brazil is the only place where rubber can be grown and harvested, and it's 1844, and you've just been given a briefing about how the vulcanization process is going to revolutionize industrialization because it allows the making of precision gaskets that can survive high heat, because without vulcanization, rubber is an interesting thing that doesn't do much at high or low temperatures except break or dissolve. Vulcanization strengthens it, in other words. And it occurs to you that having faster ships and more accurate manufacturing, especially for firearms, is going to rely on vulcanized rubber. Then you start to think, this is a potential problem, especially since we're worried about the French, at least up until about 1850, and then again after the British and French became closer gradually after the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. You become worried because you think soles for the boots of my soldiers, precision manufacturing of armaments, faster ships, gaskets for these increasingly hot engines. Where is this rubber going to come from? Rubber becomes, in other words, during this period, a strategic commodity that is linked in the minds of military men and politicians with national survival. And this, not being bad people or anything like that, this is what really drives these leaders to expand into Southeast Asia. I'm getting ahead of myself. Go to slide 18, and I've pretty much already talked about a lot of this, but the Brazilians, again, became independent on 7 September 1822. Independence or death was the cry. And this made the supply of rubber, especially after the discovery of vulcanization, seem rather unstable. So this British adventurer named Henry Wickham lived in Brazil for a while and came back with 70,000 rubber seeds, giving several hundred of them to the Botanic Gardens at Kew, which is spelled K-E-W. Kew is a great place to visit, by the way. If you're in London, take the tube to Kew. It'll take you 6 hours altogether from start to finish to go out there and look around for 4 hours, come back. Kew's a pretty cool place. Great big botanical gardens. So having these seeds was a historic event, but it took decades, going on to slide 19. It took decades for all the experimentation and planting to occur, but by the time several more decades had passed, the British were starting to grow rubber in every tropical destination they could lay their hands on. The Congo, Malaysia, and the French were growing it in Indochina, and the Americans eventually, at the end of the century, took over the Philippines from France at the end of the Spanish-American War, and I'm sure that there must have been something in there connected with the supply of rubber, because, as I noted at the bottom of the last slide, 18, there was this rubber boom. The reason for the rubber boom, just following vulcanization by a couple decades, was all the things people discovered they could do with rubber. So now, slide 19. There were other things. There was tin, which was extremely important to make the cans for food that are needed on ships for long voyages, that are needed for armies on the march, that was needed in food manufacturing equipment to coat the parts that touch the food before there was stainless steel. So these things all together, tin being available again in Southeast Asia, plus these places now provided markets for European manufactured goods, and indeed, at this point, the British were starting to think about sending opium to China. We get into the 1830s and 40s, and so they wanted to secure those sea lanes. It all adds up to plenty of reasons to colonize Southeast Asia. Let's stop here and go on to slide 20.